Roman Vescari reached across the table in front of 400 witnesses, captains, dons, wives, and killers dressed in their finest, and pulled the queen's ring from his wife's finger. Not gently, not with regret. He pulled it the way a man pulls a weed from ground he's decided he no longer wants to tend. Then he turned to the woman standing beside him in a red dress that cost more than most men earned in a year, and he slid that ring onto her finger like a crown. The ballroom went silent. Not the polite silence of surprise. The suffocating silence of 200 men who have survived wars, betrayals, and federal investigations, all holding their breath at once. Roman smiled. He thought they were impressed. He had no idea he had just handed his enemy the key to his own destruction. If this kind of story keeps you up at night, the kind where the person everyone underestimates turns out to be the only one holding everything together, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way through. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened in that ballroom, you need to understand the woman standing in it. Part 1. The Queen's Ring. Seraphine D'Angelo had not always known that silence was a weapon. She learned it the same way she learned most things, by watching men mistake noise for strength. Her father, Enzo D'Angelo, ran the D'Angelo family out of Philadelphia for 31 years, and he was the loudest man in any room he entered. He laughed too hard, drank too much, swore at subordinates in public, and died on a Tuesday morning in the parking lot of a diner he'd eaten at every week for 20 years, shot 3 times through the driver's side window by a man he'd trusted since childhood. Seraphine was 19. She sat beside his body for 6 minutes before anyone thought to pull her away, and she didn't cry once. Not because she wasn't devastated, because she was already counting. Counting who hadn't called. Counting who showed up to the funeral in clothes that were too new, too pressed, too carefully chosen for a man who died 2 days ago. Counting the small things, the wrong handshakes, the eyes that moved too quickly, the expressions of grief that lasted exactly as long as they needed to. She filed everything. She said nothing. That was how she survived the next 4 years alone in a world where every man around her was either trying to absorb what her father left behind or convince her to let someone else carry it for her. She sold off what needed to be sold, protected what needed to be protected, and built quiet agreements with people her father had dismissed as minor players. She was 23 when Roman Vescari walked into a sit-down she had arranged between 3 families who had been bleeding each other for 6 months over territory along the New Jersey coast. Roman wasn't supposed to be there. He showed up because his father, Gino Vescari, was too sick to attend and too proud to send anyone junior. Roman was 28, handsome in a way that made him slightly dangerous because he knew it, and he sat down at the table like he owned it before the food arrived. Seraphine had watched him from the corner of the room for 11 minutes before he noticed her. When he did, he smiled. The kind of smile men gave women in rooms like this. Dismissive but interested, the way you'd look at something decorative that had wandered into a business meeting. "You're D'Angelo's daughter," he said. "I'm D'Angelo," she said. He laughed. Not cruelly. He genuinely thought it was charming. She didn't smile back. She sat down across from him, opened the folder she'd been holding, and laid out a proposed resolution to the territorial dispute that addressed every point of conflict, assigned collection routes with surgical precision, and created a joint oversight arrangement that no single family could manipulate unilaterally. The 3 family heads read it. 2 of them looked at each other. The third one looked at Roman. Roman looked at Seraphine. She looked back and said nothing. That sit-down ended in 40 minutes. The agreement held for 9 years without a single major violation. Roman asked her to dinner 3 weeks later. She said yes, which surprised him. What surprised him more was that she spent the entire meal asking him questions about his father's Eastern supply chain without revealing a single thing about herself that he hadn't already known walking in. He told his father afterward that he wanted to marry her. Gino Vescari, who had been running a criminal empire since before Roman could walk, said only one thing: "That woman will either save you or bury you. Make sure you're worth saving first." Roman thought his father was being dramatic. He was wrong, but that realization was still 8 years away. They married in the spring. The wedding was held at a venue outside of Baltimore, 312 guests, no photographs that would survive a subpoena, and a ceremony that lasted exactly 22 minutes because Seraphine had negotiated with the officiant the week before on the grounds that a short ceremony meant people were less likely to leave before the toasts, and the toasts were where real alliances were made. Roman laughed when she told him that. He pulled her close and kissed her on the temple and said, "You're extraordinary, you know that?" She did know. But she also knew that knowing it privately and having it recognized publicly were two different categories, and only one of them mattered in the world they lived in. The Queen's ring came to her 3 months after the wedding, passed from Gino Vescari's hands on his deathbed. It was not technically a Vescari piece. It had belonged to Elena Mancini, the matriarch of a Chicago family, and had traveled through 7 different hands across 40 years as a symbol not of romantic possession, but of operational authority. The woman who wore it was understood by every significant criminal organization in the country to be the one whose judgment stood when disputes needed settling outside of war. Gino pressed it into Seraphine's palm while Roman stood at the foot of the bed looking slightly pale. "Don't waste it on ceremony," Gino said. His voice was already thin. "Use it when it counts." She wore it on her right hand, not her left. Roman noticed but didn't ask. The next 6 years were built on a foundation that Roman saw only the surface of. He ran the Vescari syndicate with the confidence of a man who had inherited something solid. He was good at what he did: negotiations, enforcement, reading rooms, projecting the kind of authority that kept mid-level people from getting ambitious. He wasn't stupid. He built relationships, expanded territories carefully, and kept the violence at a level that didn't attract the kind of federal attention that crushed empires. What he didn't know, what he was never told because Seraphine had decided very early that knowledge given freely was currency spent, was that the reason those 6 years were stable wasn't primarily Roman's leadership. It was the agreement Seraphine had quietly built between 5 rival families 18 months before their wedding. The Costello family out of Boston, the Morante brothers in Chicago, the Fenn organization along the Gulf Coast, the Alcazar network, which technically operated inside 3 legitimate hospitality businesses, but nobody was confused about what it really was. And the oldest surviving mafia family east of the Mississippi, the Rourke-adjacent Brannigan crew out of Pittsburgh, who had been feuding with everyone since the 1980s and had finally, exhaustedly, agreed to stop. Seraphine had spent 14 months negotiating that peace individually, in separate meetings, without ever revealing to any family that she was simultaneously talking to the others. She structured it so that the stability itself became self-enforcing. Each family had too much to lose from the collapse of the arrangement to risk breaking it, and none of them knew exactly how much the others had agreed to, which meant none of them could calculate whether defection would actually benefit them. It was the most complex diplomatic architecture in the American underworld since the Atlantic City Conference of 1929. And nobody outside of the families directly involved knew she had done it. Not Roman, not Gino, who died before she could tell him, not the lawyers, not the accountants, not the consigliere Roman trusted for everything operational. What they knew was that things ran smoothly. What they attributed that smoothness to was Roman Vescari's leadership. What they didn't ask was why things ran smoothly, even in the moments when Roman made decisions that should have triggered conflict. Seraphine let it go on. She had her reasons. Chief among them was that an empire that knew where its stability came from was an empire that could be pressured through her. An empire that didn't know was an empire that couldn't be manipulated into turning against her. She understood things about power that Roman found genuinely uncomfortable when she articulated them, so she stopped articulating them around year 3 and simply exercised them quietly. That was her second mistake. The first had been assuming that a man who admired her intelligence would continue admiring it once it began to dwarf his own. Celine Vale entered Roman's life through a legitimate channel, which was the most dangerous kind of entry. She was brought in as a communications consultant for one of the Vescari syndicate's above-board businesses, a logistics company that moved actual freight, but whose routing infrastructure also served purposes that didn't appear in any invoice. Celine's job on paper was brand management and external communications. She was 31, impeccably presented, and possessed of a quality that Seraphine clocked immediately, and Roman couldn't see at all. She listened to men like she was recording them. Not for information, necessarily. For leverage. Seraphine watched her for 4 months before she said anything to Roman. When she did, it was precise. "That woman is studying you. I don't know what she's building yet, but she's building something. Roman's response, delivered with the gentle condescension he'd developed for moments when Seraphine's observations made him feel outmaneuvered, was, "You're protective. That's not a flaw, but you're reading too much into ambition." She didn't argue. She went home that evening, made a note in a private ledger she kept in a location Roman had never been shown, and began her own investigation. She found Cassian Rourke 11 weeks later. Not the Pittsburgh Brannigans. A different Rourke. A financier who had spent the last decade positioning himself inside legitimate investment structures while quietly building relationships with every organization that threatened the traditional mafia families. He wasn't trying to join the underworld, he was trying to replace it. His model was corporate, centralized, efficient, brutal in the financial sense rather than the physical sense, and entirely incompatible with the federated structure that had kept the old families stable. Celine Vale had been Cassian Rourke's operative for 2 years before she walked into the Vescari logistics company. Her assignment wasn't Roman. Her assignment was the network Roman sat at the center of, specifically the invisible architecture beneath it that kept 5 rival families cooperating. Her assignment, in other words, was Seraphine's work. Seraphine read everything she'd compiled and sat with it for 3 days before deciding what to do. Then she did something that would later strike even her as a miscalculation. She decided not to tell Roman yet. She wanted to be certain. She wanted documentation that couldn't be challenged. She wanted to hand him a case so complete that there was no room for him to suggest she'd constructed it out of jealousy. She had learned over 8 years that Roman believed her about most things. But when the thing she was asking him to believe had anything to do with a woman, the quality of her evidence needed to be twice what it would need to be otherwise. That was the shape of her marriage. She had built something real with him. Not a fairy tale, not even a comfortable partnership, but something functional and occasionally warm and rooted in a shared recognition that they were both capable of very hard things. She wasn't unhappy. She was realistic. What she didn't account for was how fast Celine would move once she realized someone was looking. The night of the Pescara Gala, an annual gathering hosted in rotation by the major families, a combination of political summit and formal theater designed to project stability to anyone watching from the outside. Seraphine had been collecting evidence for 6 more weeks. She had enough. She had planned to sit with Roman after the event, in private, and lay it out. She never got the chance. The gala was held at the Carteret, a converted ballroom in New York that cost more per evening than most legitimate businesses earned in a month. 430 guests, 13 major family representatives. The kind of room where the wrong look could start a war and the right handshake could end one. Seraphine wore black. The Queen's ring was on her right hand. She had spoken to 3 Don's wives and 1 actual Don before the dinner service began, and the temperature in the room toward the Vescari table was warm, which meant the network was holding, which meant the 6 weeks she'd lost to watching Celine instead of maintaining relationships hadn't cost her ground yet. Roman was at the head of the table looking exactly like what he was, a powerful, attractive man at the peak of his authority, comfortable in the room, comfortable with himself. Comfortable with the woman on his arm who was not Seraphine. Celine Vale wore red. She sat 3 seats to Roman's left and conducted herself with the practiced ease of someone who had been rehearsing for this specific role for months, which she had been. Seraphine sat across from them and ate her meal and said very little. She was watching the room, which was watching Roman, which was beginning to watch Celine with the particular attention that a room full of very observant criminals gives to something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. She saw it coming 8 minutes before it happened, not because she was prescient, because she had been watching Roman's hands for 8 years, and she knew what it meant when his right hand moved to the inside of his jacket in a social setting. He was about to do something performative that he'd been building toward all evening. She set her fork down. She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not cruelty, not anger, something worse. Apology. Brief, flickering, and completely inadequate. The expression of a man who has already decided. He reached across, took her right hand, and removed the Queen's ring. The ballroom went quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone fires a gun inside it. Sudden, total, and followed by a collective breath held in unison. Seraphine did not pull her hand back. She did not stand up. She did not say a word. She watched Roman cross to Celine and watched him slide the ring onto Celine's finger with a kind of theatrical gravity that made Seraphine's chest compress with something that was not quite grief and not quite fury, but lived exactly at the intersection of both. 430 people watched this happen. Not one of them applauded. Roman turned to face the room, his chin up, his shoulders set, the posture of a man who expects acknowledgement. He got silence. Then something worse than silence. The oldest Don in the room, a 72-year-old man from New Orleans who had outlasted 6 federal investigations and 2 assassination attempts, turned his chair very slightly away from Roman and towards Seraphine and dipped his head once. Not to Roman, to her. 3 other Dons did the same thing within the next 30 seconds. Seraphine looked at her empty right hand. She looked up at the room. She stood, straightened her dress, and nodded once to the New Orleans Don, and then to each of the other 3, with the quiet precision of someone accepting acknowledgement she was owed. Then she walked out of the Carteret without saying a single word to her husband. The click of her heels on marble was the only sound in the room for a full 4 seconds after the door closed behind her. Roman watched her go. He was still smiling. He thought he'd won something. Behind him, 200 men and women sat in the kind of silence that only happens when everyone in a room is thinking the same thing and nobody is willing to say it first. In 12 hours, the first resignation letter would land on Seraphine's phone. In 24, 3 shipment agreements would be quietly rerouted. In 48, the Vescari syndicate would begin to crack from the inside out, and Roman Vescari, who had inherited an empire, married the woman who stabilized it, and then handed her ring to his enemy in front of the entire underworld, would finally begin to understand what he had actually done. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Seraphine sat in the back of her car, hands folded in her lap, the right one bare, and stared out the window at the city moving past in the dark. She didn't cry. She was already counting. The first resignation came at 6:47 in the morning. Seraphine was already awake. She hadn't slept, not because she was too upset to sleep, but because she had a list in her head that kept reorganizing itself, and she had learned years ago that fighting that process was pointless. She let it run. She lay in the dark in the guest room of her sister's house in Westchester, the one place Roman had never been given the address to. And she let her mind move through everything she knew, everything she suspected, and everything she needed to do before noon. Her phone buzzed at 6:47. The name on the screen was Marco Fenn. Not a text. A call. She answered before the second ring. "It's done," Marco said. He sounded tired. Not guilty. Tired, the way men sound when they've made a decision they know is right and know is also going to be enormously complicated. "I filed the paperwork this morning, effective immediately." Marco Fenn had been Roman's chief logistics coordinator for 9 years. He was 61 years old, had survived 2 federal indictments and a car bombing, and was the most operationally important person in the Vescari organization below the level of Don. His resignation didn't just create a vacancy, it created a structural hole that would take months to fill correctly and weeks to patch incorrectly. "I heard you," Seraphine said. "You understand what this means for the eastern routes." "I understand exactly what it means." A pause. Marco's breathing was audible. "Where do you need me?" "Nowhere yet. Stay visible. Stay available. Don't explain yourself to anyone and don't apologize for anything. If Roman calls you, answer on the 3rd ring and keep it under 4 minutes. And if he asks directly, tell him the truth. That you resigned. That's all the truth he needs for now." She hung up before he could add anything. She set the phone on the bedside table and stared at the ceiling for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked it up again and started working. By 8:15, 2 more had resigned. By 9:40, she had heard from 4 separate sources, none of whom knew about the others, that Roman had spent the morning calling people and getting answers that made progressively less sense to him. By 10, his consigliere, a 64-year-old man named Victor Caruso, who had served the Vescari family since Roman's father was healthy, sent Seraphine a single message that read, "He's going to come to you today. He doesn't know what else to do." She wrote back, "Let him come." She put the phone down and went to make coffee. Roman arrived at her sister's house at 11:20. He didn't know the address, which meant someone had given it to him, which meant Seraphine now had a small additional piece of information about who was managing the flow of access around her. She filed it without showing anything on her face when she opened the front door. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His jacket was slightly wrong. The kind of wrong that meant he'd put it on in a hurry, not the way Roman Vescari dressed when he was in control of a situation. His jaw was tight. His eyes moved to her right hand first, then to her face, then away. "Can I come in?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. She stepped back. He walked past her into the front hallway and stood there looking at a house he'd never been in, which she could see was unsettling him in a way he wouldn't have been able to articulate. "The kitchen," she said, and walked ahead of him without waiting. He sat down at the table. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and sat across from him and waited. She had learned a long time ago that the person who speaks first in a silence like this one is the person who needs something, and she didn't need anything from Roman Vescari today. He lasted 45 seconds. "Marco resigned," he said. "I know." "You know." He looked at her. "You know because you talked to him." "I know because Marco called me. There's a difference." "Is there?" His voice was flat, caught somewhere between anger and something rawer underneath it. 3 senior people are gone in one morning, Seraphine. 3. And the first call they all made was to you. Did you expect them to call Celine? The name landed like a slap. Roman's jaw tightened further. That's not what last night was. Then tell me what it was. He opened his mouth, closed it, picked up the coffee cup and set it back down without drinking. I needed to make a statement. You made one. Not the one I... He stopped, pressed 2 fingers to his forehead. The families are withdrawing, not formally, nothing on paper. But Caruso has 3 calls this morning from people who suddenly need more time on agreements we finalized in February. That doesn't happen by coincidence. No, Seraphine said. It doesn't. So explain it to me. She looked at him for a long moment. The man across from her was not stupid. She had never made the mistake of thinking he was stupid. But he was operating on a fundamental misunderstanding of his own situation that she had, in some ways, allowed to develop. She had protected him from the full picture of what kept his empire running. And now that picture was fracturing, and he was sitting in her sister's kitchen, asking her to explain it like she was a resource he could access when he needed answers and set aside when he didn't. Roman, she said, and her voice was very calm. What do you think those families are responding to? My decision last night, the ring. He said it like he was describing a business decision he stood behind but was beginning to have mild reservations about. They're reacting to the optics. They're not reacting to optics. Then what? They're reacting to the signal. She leaned forward slightly. The ring isn't jewelry. You know that. You've known that since your father put it in my hand. What you did last night wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a public declaration that the operational authority of this family has passed to a woman who has no relationship, no history, and no standing with any of those families. You didn't insult me last night, Roman. You insulted them. Silence. Roman's face went through 3 things in quick succession. Resistance, then the beginning of comprehension, then something that looked like nausea. I didn't think... No, she said. You didn't. He stood up. Not in anger, more like a man who can't process something while sitting down. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, shoulders up, hands loose at his sides. Caruso said the Fens are talking to the Mirantes. I imagine they are. Are you part of that conversation? She said nothing. He turned around. His eyes were dark. Are you part of that conversation, Seraphine? I am part of every conversation that concerns the stability of the network I helped build. That hasn't changed. What changed last night is what people believe about your judgment. My judgment. He laughed once, short and humorless. You're telling me I made a mistake. I'm telling you the consequences are already in motion. And you could stop them. He watched her face. If you wanted to, you could make one call and the Fens pull back and Caruso stops getting nervous and Marco comes back to his desk. You could do that. She didn't deny it. So why aren't you? She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands and said, very quietly, because I'm not sure yet what I'm stopping them for. That landed differently than the rest of it. She watched him absorb it, watched the first real flash of something other than frustration move across his face, something that had more edges in it, something closer to what the situation actually warranted. What does that mean? He said. It means go home, Roman. Manage what you can manage. Don't call the Mirantes directly. You'll come off as panicked, and it will make it worse. Have Caruso reach out to the Costello people first. They're the most conservative and the most likely to wait for clarity before they move. He stared at her. You're still helping me. I'm telling you how not to make it worse. That's not the same thing. He stood at the window for another moment, and she could see him trying to find the angle in this, trying to figure out whether she was managing him or genuinely helping him or both, and arriving at the uncomfortable conclusion that with Seraphine, those categories had never been fully separable. He put on his jacket properly this time, smoothed the lapels with both hands, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. Last night, he said without turning around, I want you to know it wasn't nothing. I know it wasn't nothing, she said. That's the part that's hardest. She heard the front door close. She sat at the table for 3 minutes without moving. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she had not called in 14 months. The meeting with Elena Morante took place that afternoon in a private room above a restaurant in Midtown that the Morante family had owned for 30 years. Elena was 67, compact and severe, and had been running the Chicago operation since her husband had a stroke 5 years earlier with such quiet efficiency that most of the men outside Chicago still hadn't fully processed that the transition had happened. She was the person Seraphine had spent the most time with during the 18-month negotiation that built the network, and she was the person whose opinion carried the most weight with the other families when things got complicated. She was already seated when Seraphine arrived. No food on the table, just water and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this conversation since approximately 11 p.m. the night before. You look tired, Elena said. I am tired. Sit down. Seraphine sat. Elena looked at her right hand, the bare one, and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of statement. The Fens called this morning, Elena said, then Costello, then Brannigan, which surprised me because Brannigan doesn't usually call anyone before 3 in the afternoon. What did you tell them? I told them to be patient. Elena poured water into Seraphine's glass without being asked. I told them that the situation had more layers than it appeared to last night, and that moving without full information was how empires collapsed. Thank you. Don't thank me. I didn't do it for you. I did it because I've spent 6 years watching what you built keep 5 families from going to war with each other, and I am too old to rebuild that from scratch. She set the pitcher down. What are you going to do? I need 2 weeks. For what? I have information about Celine Vale that changes the picture considerably. I've been building the documentation for 6 weeks. I need 2 more to make it bulletproof. Elena was quiet for a moment. Outside, Midtown moved past the window in the indifferent way cities move, all urgency and no direction. Is this about Roman making a fool of himself, or is this about something that threatens the network? Both. But the second one is why you need to hear it. She told Elena enough. Not everything. She never told anyone everything. That was the architecture of how she operated. But enough. The name Cassian Rourke. The corporate model. The fact that Celine Vale's presence inside the Vescari operation hadn't been an accident of attraction, but a deliberate placement by someone who wanted the old families dismantled, not through violence, but through the kind of internal confusion that made them turn on each other. Elena listened without interrupting. When Seraphine finished, she sat very still for a moment, and then she said, He wants to replace the whole structure with something cleaner, more efficient, no family loyalty, no territorial agreements, no dispute resolution that doesn't run through him. And Celine is his mechanism for getting access to the Vescari network. To me, specifically. To the agreements I built. Without those, the families have no framework for cooperation, and without that framework, Rourke can move into the vacuum. Elena looked at her with an expression that had something old in it, the expression of a woman who had seen many versions of this particular pattern played out over many decades. And Roman doesn't know any of this. Not yet. Will you tell him? Seraphine looked at the table. When I have everything I need, not before. And if something moves faster than your 2 weeks, then I'll adjust. Elena nodded slowly. She reached out and briefly touched the back of Seraphine's right hand, the bare one, with 2 fingers, just for a second. 2 weeks, she said. I'll hold the others, but Seraphine... She waited until Seraphine looked up. Don't take too long. The ring being off your hand is a wound that's already bleeding. Wounds have a timeline of their own. The problem with timelines was that Celine Vale had her own. 3 days after the gala, Roman came home to the estate to find that Celine had moved 2 boxes of her things into the East Wing guest suite. Not the main house, not anywhere near Seraphine's rooms, but inside the property line, which was itself a statement Seraphine heard about from Victor Caruso within 40 minutes of it happening. She called Roman. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was nervous. "I know what you're going to say," he started. "I doubt that," she said. "But go ahead." She's not here in that capacity. It's a security question. Celine has been getting threats." "What kind of threats?" "Anonymous, digital. Someone is sending her messages that suggest they know her location." Seraphine was quiet for 2 seconds. "And you believe her?" "I have no reason not to." "Roman." She kept her voice measured, even. The voice she used when she needed him to hear the content of what she was saying, rather than react to the tone. "That woman is in your home because she has been working toward being in your home since the day she walked into your logistics company. The threats are not real, or if they are, she generated them. Please hear me when I say this is not jealousy talking. I have documentation that—" "Seraphine." His voice was harder now, and she recognized the particular hardening, the defensive register he moved into when he felt his judgment was being questioned. "I am not going to have this conversation. Celine is staying in a guest room because she came to me with a legitimate security concern, and I responded to it. That's all." "That is not all. But fine. We'll do it this way." "What does that mean?" She hung up. She sat in the car. She was in a parking structure in White Plains, had taken the call while waiting for a source, and she breathed carefully for a moment. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The specific breathing of someone keeping a very specific thing from escaping. She had 3 days of documentation on Cassian Rourke. She needed 11 more. She had a framework in place with Elena Morante that was holding 5 families in patient suspension. She had Marco Fenn on standby and Victor Caruso quietly feeding her information from inside the estate. What she did not have was time, because Celine Vale was now physically inside the house, which meant she had access to things she hadn't had access to before, and things with access to documentation sometimes moved to control that documentation before documentation could be used against them. Seraphine called her investigator, a woman named Petra, who had worked for her independently since year 2 of her marriage, and who appeared in no records connected to the Vescari name whatsoever. "Accelerate," Seraphine said when Petra answered. "Whatever you have, I need it in 72 hours. That's not the same quality as what you'd get in 2 weeks. "I know, 72 hours. Petra delivered in 61. The file was thorough enough. Not perfect. 2 evidentiary threads that Seraphine would have preferred to shore up further were still somewhat circumstantial, but the core was solid. Celine Vale's connection to Cassian Rourke went back 26 months. Financial transfers, routed through 3 shell structures but visible if you knew what to look at. Communications, encrypted but not perfectly so. And most critically, a recorded conversation, partial but clear, between Celine and a Rourke intermediary in which the specifics of the Vescari insertion were discussed with a clinical efficiency that made Seraphine's stomach turn, not because of what it meant for her, but because of what it meant about how precisely she had been watched. She went to the estate. Front door, not the side entrance she'd been using since the gala. She wanted the staff to see her. She wanted the cameras to log her entrance time. She wanted the record to show that when she walked into that house, she was walking in as what she was, the Donna of the Vescari family, arriving to speak to her husband on a matter of urgent operational importance. Roman was in his study. Celine was not in the room, but the faint trace of a specific perfume in the hallway told Seraphine she had been recently. She noticed this. She set it aside. She put the file on Roman's desk. He looked at it, looked at her. "What is this?" "Evidence. All of it sourced, most of it documented, some of it recorded. Celine Vale has been working for Cassian Rourke for over 2 years. Her presence here is not personal. It is strategic. Rourke wants access to the cooperation network between the 5 families, specifically the infrastructure I built before our marriage. Celine's job is to destabilize you enough to create a vacuum, then assist Rourke in moving into it." Roman stared at the file. He didn't open it immediately. That pause, that particular hesitation before engaging with information, was one she knew, and it worried her more than anger would have. "Where did this come from?" he said finally. "Independent investigation. 61 hours of work on a tight timeline because Celine moved into this house, and I could not wait any longer." "Independent investigation." He looked up. "Who's been investigating people connected to my family without my authorization?" She blinked. "Roman? Read the file. I'm asking you a question, and I'm asking you to read the documentation in front of you before we have the conversation about methodology, because the methodology doesn't matter if the content is what I believe it to be." He opened the file. She watched him read. His face stayed controlled mostly. Roman was good at controlled, but she saw his jaw shift twice, and she saw the moment he reached the section about the financial transfers because his right hand went flat on the desk the way it did when he was pressing something down. He read for 11 minutes. Then he closed the file. "This is incomplete," he said. "2 threads are circumstantial. The rest is documented." "Incomplete evidence is not evidence." She stared at him. "Roman, I'm not saying she's clean. I'm saying this isn't enough to move on without being certain. This is enough to remove her from this property immediately and begin a formal, 'I'll look into it.'" He slid the file off to the side of his desk with a motion that made something cold move through her chest. "I'll have Caruso review the methodology and verify what can be verified." "You'll have Caruso." She sat very still. "Victor Caruso, who Celine has spoken to privately on at least 3 occasions in the last 10 days, according to building security logs. You'll have that man review evidence against the woman he's been meeting with." Roman's eyes sharpened. "How do you know about those meetings?" "Because I've been paying attention, which is what I've always done, which is why this family is still standing." He stood up. Not explosively. Roman didn't do explosions, which was one of the things she'd respected about him, and one of the things that sometimes made him harder to read than she needed him to be. He moved to the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the grounds. "You built something here," he said quietly. "I know that. I've known it for a long time. Maybe I didn't say it enough. Maybe I said it wrong. But I've known it. Roman, and I know that what I did at the gala it was wrong. The way I did it, in public. I know that." She waited. He turned around, and she saw it before he said it, saw it in the particular set of his mouth, the way his shoulders had changed, the thing in his eyes that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite resolve, but was a terrible combination of both. "But I need you to understand that I can't make decisions about people in this organization based on evidence you compiled in 61 hours through sources you won't name. That's not how this works. You know that." She stood up slowly. "I know," she said very quietly, "that I have spent 8 years ensuring that your decisions have consequences worth surviving. And I know that right now you are looking at proof that someone is actively working to destroy what I built. And you are choosing to table it because accepting it would require you to admit that you let her in. So yes, Roman, I know how this works." She picked up her bag. She left the file on his desk. She walked out of the study, down the hallway with the trace of Celine's perfume in it, through the front door, down the stone steps, and into the car where her driver was waiting. 3 blocks from the estate, her phone lit up with a notification from a security monitoring service she'd set up on a separate account 2 years earlier, tied to the estate's internal communication systems. A message had been sent from the estate's main secure server 17 minutes ago, while she was in the study with Roman. The recipient was an external address she didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The attachment was a file with a name she recognized immediately because she had spent 61 hours building it. Her file. Her evidence against Celine Vale. Transmitted in full to an outside address before Roman had finished reading it. Seraphine sat in the back of the car and looked at her phone and understood, with the absolute clarity of someone who has just watched a door close in front of them, that she was no longer working with 61 hours of documentation. She was working with nothing. Because in 17 minutes, Cassian Rourke had received everything she had, which meant he knew exactly what she knew, exactly what she could prove, and exactly where her evidence was thin. She was exposed. And somewhere in the estate behind her, the person who had just sent that file was already making the next move. The move that would come not as a counteroffer or a negotiation, but as something designed to hit before she could recover. She told her driver to pull over. She sat in the stopped car for 30 seconds. Then she called Elena Morante and said 4 words. "It's moving faster now." Elena picked up on the first ring. That alone told Seraphine something. Elena Morante did not answer calls quickly, not from anyone, not even her own children. The fact that she answered before the second ring meant she had been sitting with her phone in her hand, which meant she already knew something was wrong. "Talk," Elena said. "My file was transmitted from the estate's secure server while I was still in the building. External address. Rourke has everything I had on Celine." A silence. The specific silence of a woman recalibrating. When? 17 minutes ago. I'm still 3 blocks from the property. Who sent it? From the server, the authentication would show Roman, but Roman was in the room with me when it went out. Another silence, longer this time. Victor Caruso. That's my read. Caruso has been with that family for 30 years. 29. He joined 8 months after Gino took over the New York operation. Seraphine had always been precise about timelines. Long enough to build loyalty, long enough to build other things too. Elena's breathing was audible now, the measured breathing of a woman who is angry and managing it. "What do you need?" 48 hours. Hold everyone in place. Don't let the fens move. Don't let Brannigan do anything dramatic. And if Costello calls you again, tell him that the situation is developing and that patience is the only thing standing between him and a very expensive mistake. And in 48 hours? I'll either have something or I won't. But I need to know the network holds long enough for me to find out which. She ended the call and told her driver to take her to Petra's office. Petra worked out of a building in the Bronx that looked from the outside like a mid-tier accounting firm, which was accurate in the sense that Petra did keep accounts. Meticulous, encrypted, and considerably more legally complicated than a standard tax return. She was 44, had spent 12 years in federal financial intelligence, before leaving under circumstances she had never fully explained to Seraphine, and had a quality that Seraphine valued above almost everything else in a person. She did not speculate. She stated what she knew, flagged what she didn't, and refused to fill the gap between the two with anything that wasn't documented. She was at her desk when Seraphine walked in, which meant she'd gotten a warning call from someone. Seraphine's driver, probably, who had standing instructions to do exactly that. On her second monitor was a network diagram Seraphine hadn't seen before, dense with nodes and connection lines. "Sit down," Petra said without preamble. "What is that?" "The external address your file went to." Petra turned to the diagram. "I started pulling it the second you called Elena. It routes through 4 relay points before it resolves, but the endpoint is a server cluster registered to a holding company called Meridian Consolidated Advisors. Rourke. Rourke's third-layer structure, not the top, not the bottom, the working layer." Petra pointed to a node near the center of the diagram. "But here's what's interesting. This cluster has been receiving traffic from inside the Vescari estate for longer than tonight." Seraphine went very still. "How long?" Petra turned to look at her directly. "The earliest traffic I can find is 11 months ago." The room did something strange for a moment. Not literally, but in the way rooms do when information arrives that rearranges the architecture of everything you thought you understood. Seraphine sat down. 11 months, she said, at minimum. That's the earliest I can get to quickly. There may be older traffic I haven't reached yet. 11 months ago, Celine Vale had been inside the Vescari logistics operation for approximately 4 months, which meant the information pipeline from the estate to Rourke had been running not just since Celine arrived, but since almost the beginning, which meant either Celine had moved faster than Seraphine had calculated, or Celine hadn't built the pipeline. Someone already inside had. "Caruso," Seraphine said again, but this time it wasn't a read, it was a confirmation. "The authentication on the traffic is consistent with his access credentials, but Seraphine—" Petra paused, which was unusual enough that Seraphine felt it physically. "There's something else. One of the early transmission files. I pulled its index before the encryption resolved." She turned her second monitor around. On the screen was a partial file manifest, the kind that showed what a transmitted package contained without showing the full content. Seraphine read the manifest. She read it again. The third time, she made herself read it slowly and carefully because she needed to be absolutely certain she was reading it correctly and not making the error of seeing what she feared rather than what was there. She was reading it correctly. The transmitted file from 11 months ago contained operational summaries of the cooperation agreements between the 5 families. Not surface details. Not the kind of information Roman had access to. The specific structural architecture of how the agreements enforced themselves, the leverage points, the dispute resolution mechanisms, the financial interdependencies that Seraphine had built as self-reinforcing deterrents. Information that only 2 people in the world had in that level of detail, Seraphine herself. And the person she had trusted enough to share the framework with during the negotiation phase 18 months before the wedding, in order to get that person's assessment of whether the architecture was sound. She hadn't shared it with Caruso. She hadn't shared it with Roman. She hadn't shared it with Elena. She had shared it with one person, in a 3-hour meeting in a private room, because she had needed a second opinion from someone who understood the structural mechanics of multi-party criminal agreements and who she had trusted completely at the time. The person she had trusted was Marco Fenn. She didn't call him. She drove to him. Marco lived in a house in Riverdale that was too large for one person, but that he'd kept since his wife died 6 years ago. A colonial with a circular driveway and lights on in the kitchen at 2 in the afternoon, because Marco had never fully adapted to living alone and kept lights on in rooms whether he was in them or not. He opened the door before she rang. He'd seen the car coming up the drive. His face did a complicated thing when he saw her expression, a thing that started as concern and moved, in the space of about 2 seconds, into something else. Something braced. She walked past him into the house, into the kitchen, because the kitchen was where the conversation in her sister's house had happened, and some part of her brain had filed it as the correct room for this kind of reckoning. She turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his coat, as if he hadn't fully committed to the room. 11 months, she said. He didn't ask what she meant. That was the thing she would remember afterward. He didn't ask what she meant. He just stood there in his coat with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the expression of a man who has known. This conversation was coming for a very long time and has never been able to figure out how to stop it from arriving. "Seraphine," he said, "don't." Her voice was quiet. The particular quiet that happens after the volume is no longer necessary. "Don't do the part where you explain. I need you to listen to what I already know, and then you can tell me what I have wrong. That's all the conversation this is going to be." He said nothing. He stood there. "You were present for every structural discussion about the 5-family framework. You gave me assessment feedback on the leverage mechanics in month 14 of the negotiation. That feedback was accurate and useful, and I trusted you and incorporated it." She kept her eyes on his face. 11 months ago, a transmission went from inside the Vescari estate to a Rourke-controlled server cluster. The file contained the structural architecture of the framework, not summaries. Mechanics. The kind of detail that only exists in 2 places: my private records and your memory of those 3 hours. Marco's jaw moved. He wasn't going to deny it. She could see that. He was trying to find the frame. "How long has Rourke had you?" she said. A long moment. The kitchen clock made a sound, traffic outside. 14 months, he said, 1 month before the transmission, which meant the transmission was his proof of value, his down payment. "Why?" she said. And she meant it as a real question, not a rhetorical one, because she genuinely needed to understand the shape of it. Marco finally moved, took his coat off, folded it over the back of a chair with the methodical care of a man doing something with his hands, so he didn't have to look at her while he started. "Rourke came to me with numbers," he said. "Real numbers. The Eastern logistics operation loses 22% annually to redundancies in the old family structure. 22%. That's not waste. That's the cost of maintaining the diplomatic architecture. The cost of keeping 5 families from killing each other. Rourke showed me what the same operation looks like centralized, efficient, no territorial disputes, no tribute negotiations, no sit-downs that last 3 days over 2 points of percentage. And you thought that was worth destroying what I built. I thought it was inevitable." He looked at her finally. His eyes were tired in a way that wasn't tonight tired. It was years tired. "I didn't think I was destroying anything. I thought I was getting ahead of something that was going to happen anyway. By feeding the structural mechanics to the man who wants to replace the old families with a corporate model that answers only to him. By positioning myself on the right side of what's coming." She looked at him for a long time. This man she had trusted. This man who had called her at 6:47 in the morning and asked where she needed him, who had resigned from the Vescari operation with what she had read as loyalty and what she now understood was a controlled withdrawal to a safer position before the structure fell. "You called me yesterday morning," she said. "You resigned. You asked where I needed you." "I know." Was that also positioning? He didn't answer, which was an answer. She picked up her bag. "If you contact Rourke or Celine Vale before I tell you otherwise, every piece of documentation I have on this conversation and the 11 months that preceded it goes to every family head simultaneously and to the 3 federal task forces that are currently within 6 months of having enough to move on Rourke's financial structure." She kept her voice flat. "Informational. I am not threatening you, Marco. I am telling you the shape of the situation. You are more useful to me as a controlled variable than as an active problem. Don't make yourself into an active problem." She walked out of his kitchen, down the hallway, through the front door. In the car, she sat with both hands in her lap and looked at nothing for a moment that lasted longer than it felt. Then she took 3 deliberate breaths and called Elena back. "I need to change the timeline," she said. What happened in the next 18 hours happened faster than any of the preceding weeks, because that is the nature of things that have been building invisibly. They reach a pressure point, and then everything moves at once. The first thing that moved was the evidence against her. She found out about it through a source inside the New York DA's office, a paralegal who had passed her information twice before on matters peripheral to the Vescari operation, who sent her a 3-word text at 9:15 in the evening. "Something is coming." She called the number back immediately. The paralegal answered in a whisper, which meant she was still at the office. "There's a filing being prepared," the paralegal said. "Affidavit. Multiple attachments. It names you as the primary source of a series of intelligence leaks to rival family operations going back 4 years. Seraphine felt the floor of the situation drop. What kind of leaks? Shipment routes, enforcement schedules, the names of 3 Vescari family members who were operating under protected identities. 2 of them were subsequently a pause. "They're both dead, Seraphine. The affidavit connects their deaths to the leaked identities and attributes the leak to you." She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. "Who signed the affidavit?" "It's not signed yet. It's being finalized, but the primary declarant is listed as V. Caruso. Victor Caruso. Not just the pipeline, the weapon. And the attachments? Financial records mostly. Some communication transcripts. I haven't seen all of them. But whoever built this built it carefully. It looks real, Seraphine. It looks like something that's been compiled over time, not manufactured overnight. Because it had been compiled over time, by Rourke's people, using the architecture that Marco had handed them 14 months ago. They'd had over a year to build a case, to fabricate documents that matched the structural specifics closely enough that anyone without the full picture would read them as authentic. She thanked the paralegal, told her to go home and not come back to the office tonight, and ended the call. The fabricated evidence against her was already built. Caruso was about to sign it, which meant sometime in the next 12 to 36 hours, Roman Vescari was going to be presented with a documented case, far more polished than the 61 hours of real evidence she'd given him, that his wife had been leaking protected information to rival families and had gotten 2 of his people killed. She sat in the car outside Marco's house in the dark and thought about what came next. What came next, she understood now, was something she had been trying to avoid since the night at the Carteret. She had been trying to solve this with documentation, with evidence, with the kind of careful architecture that had defined how she operated for the entirety of her adult life. She had been trying to win the way she always won, quietly, precisely, in the spaces between what other people were looking at. That option was gone. Rourke had her documentation. Caruso was about to deliver a fabricated case to Roman. Marco Fenn was a compromised variable, and she was sitting outside a house in Riverdale with no file, no leverage she could deploy in the next 12 hours, and a story about to be told about her that she had no current way to contradict. She called Elena one more time. "I need the summit," she said. "Not in 2 weeks. Now, 4 days." Elena was quiet for a moment. "That's not enough time to prepare. I know. If we call a summit in 4 days, Roman will know it's about him. He'll either try to control it or he'll panic. Let him panic. I need every family head in one room before that affidavit gets signed. Once it's filed, it becomes a public document inside the DA's office. And once it's a public document, half those family heads will move away from me on principle, regardless of what they believe. I need them to hear me before the paper exists. A very long silence. Seraphine could hear Elena breathing, could hear the particular quality of the silence of an intelligent woman running through the implications of a decision that had no clean version. 4 days, Elena said finally. The Carteret is out. I know a place. It needs to hold 13 principals and their seconds. It will. And Roman? Seraphine thought about Roman, about the man in his study who had slid her evidence to the side of his desk, who had let Celine into his home, who had removed the Queen's ring in front of 400 people and handed it to his enemy, who had looked at her this morning with something in his eyes that was part apology and part the stubbornness of a man who was too invested in a mistake to admit it yet. Roman comes, she said. He needs to be there. He needs to see what happens when every family chooses. And if he tries to shut it down, he won't. Because by the time he finds out what he's walking into, he'll already be inside. She told Elena the location. She ended the call. She sat in the car for one more moment in the dark outside Marco Fenn's house, with its 2 large rooms and its lights on in empty spaces. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Mrs. Vescari. The voice was male, calm, the kind of calm that was manufactured and maintained rather than natural. My name is Cassian Rourke. I think it's past time we spoke directly. She felt something move through her that wasn't quite fear. Fear was for situations you hadn't anticipated. This felt more like the drop in temperature that comes before a storm you've been watching build for a long time finally arrives. Mr. Rourke, she said, I have your file, all of it, and I want you to understand that I take no pleasure in what's about to happen to you. His voice was measured, reasonable, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this specific call. The affidavit will be signed tomorrow morning. By tomorrow afternoon, your husband will have a copy. By tomorrow evening, 4 of your 5 family contacts will have heard about it through channels they trust. And you're calling to tell me this because I am offering you an exit, a clean one. A brief pause. Walk away from the network, all of it. Dissolve the cooperation agreements, release the families from their obligations to each other, and disappear from the criminal world quietly. In exchange, the affidavit goes away. The fabricated evidence is destroyed. You get your life. She said nothing. Mrs. Vescari, Seraphine. He said her name like he thought saying it would make him more persuasive. You built something remarkable. I mean that without condescension, but you built it in an era that is ending. The federated model is inefficient. Loyalty-based structures collapse under pressure. What I'm building is sustainable. What you built is beautiful, and it's finished. She let the silence run for a full 5 seconds. Mr. Rourke, she said, I want you to hear what I'm about to say very carefully, because I'm going to say it once, and I'm not going to repeat it. Of course. The affidavit gets signed, the evidence gets filed, and my husband reads every word of it. That's fine. Let it happen. She kept her voice completely even. Because what you don't know, what you couldn't know, because the piece of the architecture you got from Marco Fenn was the piece I showed Marco Fenn, is that the actual structural core of those cooperation agreements isn't in any document you've received. It lives in relationships that took me 14 months to build individually, and those relationships have a specific response protocol for exactly this kind of attack. You've spent 14 months building a case against me. I've spent 6 years building something those families will not surrender because a man they've never met filed paperwork. A silence on his end now, less comfortable than before. You're making a mistake, he said. Maybe, she said, but it's mine to make. She ended the call. She sat in the car with the phone in her lap and understood, with complete clarity, what she had just done. She had refused the exit. She had told Rourke to file the affidavit. She had committed fully to the summit in 4 days, without documentation, without a file, with nothing but the architecture of relationships she'd built and the specific knowledge that the real structural core of those agreements was something Rourke couldn't replicate, only destroy. And if she was wrong, if even one family had read the fabricated evidence and moved away before she could reach them, if Roman accepted the affidavit as true and publicly stripped her of everything before the summit, if Rourke's move was faster than 4 days, then she would lose everything. Not just the ring, not just the marriage, the network, the agreements. The thing she had spent a decade of her life building in rooms no one knew about. She would be finished. The car was cold. She hadn't noticed until now. She told her driver to take her back to Westchester. She needed to sleep, because the version of herself that could do what needed to be done in the next 96 hours was not the version that sat in dark parking lots cataloging her own exposure. She needed to be something other than what she'd been for the last 72 hours, careful, measured, working inside systems she'd designed for exactly this kind of threat. Those systems were gone. The documentation was gone. The careful architecture of proof and process was in Rourke's hands. What she had left was herself. What she knew. What she'd built before anyone told her to build it, in rooms she'd entered alone, with families who had agreed to something not because of a document, but because she'd made them believe it was possible. She needed to go back to that, to the thing before the paperwork, the thing that was just her and a table, and the willingness to sit in a room and speak directly about things that nobody else was willing to name. She needed to go back to being the woman she was before she became what Roman needed her to be. The car moved through the dark city, and Seraphine D'Angelo Vescari sat in the back of it, with her hands in her lap and her right hand bare and her jaw set at an angle that her father would have recognized immediately, and thought about 4 days, and what 4 days could hold, and whether she was still the person who could fill them. She decided she was. She had no alternative but to be right. She slept 4 hours. Not well. The kind of sleep that is really just the body overriding the brain's insistence on staying alert. A brief unconsciousness that left her with a stiff neck and the specific clarity that comes from having no more room for doubt. She was dressed by 5:30. Coffee, no food. The guest room in her sister's house had a window that faced east, and she stood at it for 3 minutes watching the sky go from black to the particular dark gray that comes just before the color returns. And she thought about the next 92 hours with the same methodical attention she had given to every significant operation of her adult life. By 6, she had called 6 people. By 7, she had responses from 5 of them. By 8, she was in a car heading south toward a building she had held the title to through a shell company for 11 years and had never used for anything. The Opera House was in a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan that had been redeveloped twice since it was built and had resisted both attempts at gentrification through the combined forces of structural complication and her deliberate management of the surrounding property values. It looked from the outside like a building that had been closed for renovation for several years, which was accurate in the sense that the renovation permits were real and the renovation itself had never been completed, and it had an interior that was large enough, acoustically complex enough, and sufficiently removed from any occupied building to serve as a space where things could be said and done without outside interference. She walked through it with Elena Morante's logistics coordinator, a woman named Ruth, who organized events for the Morante family and who had, over a 20-year career, arranged things in spaces that were never supposed to have events in them. Ruth moved through the house with a flashlight and a measuring tape and a notebook and said very little, which Seraphine appreciated. 72 hours, Seraphine said. Ruth looked up from her notebook. That's tight. I know. 13 principals, each with a second. Catering, security sweep, sight lines for the principals. No catering. This isn't a dinner. Single room, main floor, chairs arranged so no family is positioned above any other. Equal sight lines to the center. No podium. She walked the space as she spoke, measuring with her stride. I'll stand in the center. The principals sit in a ring around me. Their seconds stand behind them. Ruth wrote, Security. My own people for the perimeter. Each family brings their own internal security, standard protocol. Weapons checked at the building entrance, not the room entrance. I want them armed inside the room. This needs to feel like a summit, not a tribunal. And Vescari. Roman gets an invitation through Caruso, which means Rourke finds out about the summit through Caruso, which is what I want. Ruth looked up again. This time she didn't write anything. You want Rourke to know. I want Rourke to try to stop it. A long pause. Ruth was not a woman who expressed alarm easily, but something moved across her face now that was in the neighborhood of it. That's a risk. Yes, Seraphine said. Everything from here is a risk. Make it ready. The affidavit was signed at 9:47 the next morning. She knew the exact time because the paralegal from the DA's office sent her a text with a single character, a period. The period meant it had happened. The period meant the document now existed in the world, with Victor Caruso's signature on it and Rourke's fabricated evidence attached, and it would reach Roman by afternoon. She was in the opera house when it arrived. She was overseeing the arrangement of chairs and thinking about sequencing, who needed to arrive first, who needed to arrive last, which family heads needed to be seated next to, which in order to minimize the ambient territorial tension that would already be running high given the circumstances of the gathering. The logistics of that kind of thing were something she had always handled herself, not because she didn't trust others to do it, but because the physical arrangement of a room communicated things that words couldn't, and she wasn't willing to delegate communication she couldn't review. Her phone buzzed. Not the paralegal this time. Roman. She answered. He didn't say anything for a moment. She could hear his breathing, slightly too fast. The breathing of a man who has just read something that made his chest compress. Tell me this isn't real, he said. She said nothing. Seraphine. His voice cracked on the second syllable of her name, which was not something she had ever heard before. Tell me this is fabricated. Tell me Caruso put his name on a lie. I can't tell you that through a phone call. I'm not... This says you leaked names, protected identities. Donato and Ferrara are dead, Seraphine. They're dead, and this says... I know what it says. Did you... He stopped. She could hear him working to get control of his breathing. Did you give those names to anyone? No. Caruso has financial records, fabricated. He has communication transcripts, also fabricated, built on the structural information that Marco Fenn sold to Cash-in Rourke 14 months ago. A silence that was different from the previous ones. Sharper. The silence of something landing. Marco. Yes. Marco called you the morning after the gala. He resigned. He asked where you needed him. Yes, I know. Did you know then? No. I found out the day after I came to your study, after my file was transmitted from your estate's secure server while I was sitting across from you. She kept her voice steady. That transmission went to a Rourke-controlled server cluster. The authentication showed your credentials, Roman. Someone used your access to send my evidence to your enemy while you were reading it. Another silence. Longer. Caruso was in the building that morning, Roman said, very quietly. Yes. The sound on the line changed. She heard him move, heard what sounded like a chair, something physical. The sound of a man who cannot be still with what he's just understood. He's been in that building for 30 years. He was there when my father... He stopped. I know, she said. How long has he been with Rourke? I don't know the full timeline yet. The financial pipeline to Rourke goes back at least 14 months from Marco's involvement. Caruso, maybe longer. A sound from Roman that wasn't quite a word. Roman. She let his name carry everything she didn't have time to say. The weight of the 8 years, the mistakes, the things she'd known and hadn't said and should have said differently. I need you to do something very hard right now. I need you to read that affidavit again, and I need you to do it knowing that every piece of it was built to be believed. The fabrication is careful. Some of it will feel true to you because it was built by someone who knows your operation from the inside. I need you to hold that and not act on it until you hear me in person. When? Day after tomorrow. I need your word that you'll come and that you won't move against me before then. A very long silence. She could hear his breathing slowing, which was something, the sound of a man pulling himself back from the edge of a reaction that would cost them both. You're asking me to on a document that says my wife got 2 of my people killed, he said. I'm asking you to sit on a fabricated document for 48 hours so that I can show you, in front of every family head you work with, exactly who built it and why. Silence. Where? He said. She gave him the address. She told him to come alone except for 2 men he trusted without reservation, and she said that deliberately, knowing that Caruso would ask him who those men were, and that the answer would tell her something about how much Roman had understood from this conversation. He showed up the next morning at the opera house with 2 men she had never seen before, young, quiet, the kind of men who had been with him long enough to be loyal, but not long enough to have been reached by anything. Not Caruso, not anyone from the inner circle. He was learning, possibly too late, but learning. The summit night arrived in the way that significant nights often arrive, with no ceremony, no announcing quality in the air, just the ordinary movement of hours that looked like every other hour, until suddenly they were the ones that everything afterward would be measured against. By 7 in the evening, 11 of the 13 principal family representatives were inside the opera house. The remaining 2 arrived at 7:20 and 7:31 respectively. The Brannigan representative deliberately late, as was his custom, a performance of indifference that nobody was fooled by, but everyone accommodated because that was the cost of having him in the room. The chairs were in a ring. Seraphine stood in the center of the ring as each family entered. She greeted each principal by name, not formally, not ceremonially, but with the specific quality of recognition that comes from genuine familiarity, the small true thing that can't be performed. She knew these people. She had sat across from them in difficult rooms and navigated difficult things, and they knew it, and the knowing of it was in the room already before anyone sat down. Roman sat in the Vescari seat. His jaw was a hard line. His eyes moved to her once, briefly, when she passed him, and she gave him a small nod that was not reassurance. It was information. Stay still, let it happen. He stayed still. The room settled. 13 principals. 13 seconds standing behind them. Seraphine in the center, hands at her sides, no notes, no file. Nothing between her and the ring of people she had spent a decade building relationships with. She had just opened her mouth to begin when the far door opened. It wasn't a door anyone was supposed to use. It was a service entrance at the back of the house, sealed from the inside, accessible only with a specific override code that should have been known to exactly 3 people: Seraphine, Ruth, and the security coordinator Ruth had used for the perimeter. The door opened and 4 men came through it, not in formal wear, not announced, moving with the specific efficiency of people who had rehearsed the approach. Behind them, moving at a measured pace that communicated the absolute confidence of a man who had decided he owned the room before he entered it, was Cassian Rourke. He was younger than she had imagined from his reputation. Mid-40s, lean, wearing a dark suit that was precisely correct for the occasion, in a way that told her he had known about the summit for long enough to dress for it. His face was the face of a man who had spent years in rooms where other people set the terms and had decided some time ago that he was finished with that arrangement. He stopped just inside the door. His 4 men fanned out along the wall. Not reaching for weapons, there were no weapons visible, but positioned with the spatial awareness of people who knew exactly where everyone in the room was and had already calculated the distance. Every security detail in the room went rigid simultaneously, 13 different hands moving toward 13 different weapons. Nobody moves. Seraphine's voice cut through the room with a clarity that came from the acoustic properties of the space and the specific authority of a person who has trained herself for 20 years to mean exactly what she says. Nobody draws. Sit down. Remarkably, everyone sat down. Rourke looked at her from across the ring. Something moved in his expression, something that looked almost like respect, and she filed it as dangerous. Men who respected her in that particular way were men who had decided she was an obstacle worth acknowledging before they removed it. "You invited me," he said. He said it to the room, not just to her, making himself a participant rather than an intruder. "I did," she said. Roman's head turned. She could see it in her peripheral vision, the sharp turn of a man who has just learned something he did not expect. She had not told him Rourke was coming. She hadn't been certain Rourke would come, and she had needed Roman's reaction to Rourke's arrival to be authentic. "You're the one who sent the override code," Roman said. Not to Rourke, to Seraphine. "Yes." "Why?" "Because the conversation I need to have requires everyone in it." Rourke walked forward slowly, the 4 men staying at the wall, and stopped at the edge of the ring of chairs. He looked around it, at the family heads, at the seconds behind them, at Roman, and finally back at Seraphine. "You called a summit to introduce me to the families." "I called a summit," she said, "to let the families see you. There's a difference." He tilted his head slightly, recalibrating. "I'm not your enemy, Mrs. Vescari. I've said this. You fabricated evidence that would have me charged as an accessory to murder. You turned my husband's consigliere and my most trusted logistics contact. You've spent 14 months dismantling the cooperation architecture I built." She kept her voice even. "I understand you don't see that as enmity. I'm asking you to understand that the distinction doesn't matter to the people in this room." She turned to face the ring. "Each of you received the affidavit through your usual channels this morning or yesterday evening. You know what it says. You know my name is on it. I want to ask each of you, before I say anything else, whether any of you, any single person in this room, actually believes it. Silence. Not the uncertain silence of people deciding. The dense, weighted silence of people who have already decided and are waiting to see who speaks first. The New Orleans Don, the same one who had turned his chair away from Roman at the Carteret, cleared his throat. He was 72 years old and had the voice of someone who had been conserving it for things worth saying. I received it, he said. I read it twice. I've known Seraphine D'Angelo since she was 23 years old. I knew her father. A pause. I didn't believe a word of it. Neither did I, said Elena Morante from the Chicago seat. The Fenn organization reviewed it. Marco Fenn's replacement, a younger man named Aldrich, who had been installed in the last 72 hours after Seraphine had made 3 calls, sat forward. Our financial analysts identified 4 inconsistencies in the transaction records within 2 hours of receiving it, one by one around the ring. Not all of them. 2 of the representatives stayed quiet, which she noted and filed, but 11 out of 13, in various degrees of directness, indicated they had not accepted the affidavit as genuine. Rourke stood at the edge of the ring and listened to this. His face stayed controlled, but she was watching his hands, and his hands were doing something. A small repetitive motion of the right thumb against the index finger that she recognized as what people did when they were running calculations and not getting the answer they expected. You built something impressive, he said, when the room had finished. His voice was still smooth, still measured. 13, across the eastern seaboard, cooperating without a central authority. It's remarkable, genuinely. But it's also fragile. One person is the connective tissue. One person leaves, he looked at Seraphine, and the whole structure is exposed. One person built it, Elena said from the Chicago seat. Her voice was dry. That's not the same as one person being the only thing holding it. Isn't it? Rourke looked at the room. Without Seraphine's individual relationships, what do you actually have? A set of agreements that have never been tested because the woman who made them has been managing every pressure point for 6 years. What happens in 2 years? 5? When she's not available? When she's... He paused, a small pause. Otherwise occupied? That, Seraphine said, is actually a fair question. Rourke looked at her. The room looked at her. The architecture I built has a succession mechanism, she said. It has redundancies. It has documented protocols for dispute resolution that don't depend on my personal involvement. She looked at the ring of family heads. What none of you knew, because I built it this way deliberately, is that each of your agreements contains a mutual reinforcement clause. If any one family is attacked, financially, legally, physically, through a mechanism that threatens the cooperative framework, the other families have pre-committed responses, automatic ones, responses that don't require a vote or a discussion or a phone call. She looked back at Rourke. The affidavit you filed this morning triggered 5 of those clauses simultaneously. A sound in the room. Not panic. Something more like the collective inhalation of people realizing the dimensions of a space they thought they knew. Rourke's thumb stopped moving against his index finger. That's not in any document I received. No, she said, it isn't. Because Marco hadn't known about it. Because she had built the mutual reinforcement structure in the final 3 months of the negotiation. After Marco had given her his assessment and she had thanked him and quietly decided that the information she'd shared with him was enough, but not everything. She had always known, at some cellular level, that the person who knew the whole architecture was the architecture's greatest vulnerability. So she had never told anyone the whole thing. Not Marco, not Elena, not Roman. No one. She stood in the center of the ring and watched Rourke's face move through the stages of a man who has discovered that the building he believed he understood has rooms he never found. Then the lights went out. Not gradually. All at once. The opera house went completely dark. And in the darkness, Seraphine heard the specific sound she had been both dreading and prepared for. The controlled movement of people who had been waiting for this moment, positioned throughout the space, moving with the efficiency of people who knew exactly where they were going and had rehearsed it in the dark. Rourke's mercenaries. Not 4. Not the 4 men who had come through the service entrance. More. She had known there would be more. Had known it the moment he walked in too calmly for a man walking into hostile territory. and she had prepared for it in the way that she had prepared for most things in her life. Not by preventing the threat, but by understanding it precisely enough to survive it. She dropped. Not elegantly. She went straight down to the floor, palms flat, and rolled left with the specific muscle memory of a woman who had spent 3 years in her 20s training for exactly this kind of moment. Training she had never told Roman about, and that most of the people in her life had assumed she didn't have. In the dark, something moved through the air above her, fast, close, and hit the chair she had been standing next to with a crack of impact that told her it had been a baton or a club, something non-lethal, which meant Rourke's orders were to subdue rather than kill, which meant she had approximately 3 minutes before someone decided to escalate. The room was erupting. She could hear it without seeing it. The specific chaos of 13 security details reacting simultaneously to a threat in an enclosed dark space, which was dangerous and loud and, crucially, unpredictable in ways that worked in her favor. Her hand found her phone. She pressed a pre-staged contact. The lights came back on. Not the full house lights. The emergency circuit she'd had Ruth wire into an independent power source 2 days ago, fed by a generator in the basement and triggered remotely. Amber emergency lighting, enough to see by. What she saw? Rourke's men, she counted 9 total, the 4 from the entrance plus 5 who had been concealed in the upper gallery, had moved into the center of the room and were now in the middle of a situation they had not planned for, which was 13 separate security details, all reacting to them from different angles simultaneously. The first shot fired was from Brannigan's second, which was characteristic of the Brannigan organization's general approach to ambiguity. It hit one of Rourke's gallery men in the shoulder, which was enough to change the calculation entirely, because the moment one person is shot, the room decides that the non-lethal phase is over. "Hold!" Seraphine was on her feet. Her voice was as loud as she could make it, which was loud enough. "Nobody fires again. Nobody!" 2 seconds of suspended chaos. The room held, barely. Rourke. She found him. He was at the far end of the ring, 2 of his men close to him, his composure slightly less complete than it had been 60 seconds ago. The shoulder injury to his gallery man had recalibrated something in his expression. "Call them off." "You should call them off." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the room, at 9 of his people surrounded by the collective security apparatus of 13 mafia families, all of whom were armed, positioned, and considerably more familiar with the space than his mercenaries were. "Stand down," he said. His voice was still controlled, still the voice of a man who believed he had other moves. His men went still. Seraphine walked across the ring to the center. She was breathing harder than she would have liked. She could feel it, the elevated pulse, the slight tremor in her hands that came from adrenaline rather than fear. But she kept her shoulders down and her pace deliberate and her face composed, because the room was watching her, and the room needed to see what they needed to see. She stopped 2 feet from Rourke. Up close, he was tired in a way the controlled presentation hadn't shown from across the room. The kind of tired that meant the last 48 hours had not gone the way he'd planned, which she found briefly, grimly satisfying. "You came tonight because you thought a room full of frightened old family heads would capitulate if you demonstrated that the summit could be disrupted," she said, quietly enough that it was between them. "You thought the show of force would be enough." "It usually is," he said. "These aren't usual rooms." He looked at her. His expression had something in it that she hadn't expected and didn't quite have a name for. Not anger, not calculation, something more personal. "You're going to lose eventually, you know. The structure you built is elegant, but elegant things break. So do efficient ones," she said. "They just break differently." She stepped back. She turned to the room. Rourke's men were still frozen in their positions, the family security details still trained on them with the specific alertness of people waiting for the next cue. "There's a recording," Seraphine said to the room. "Celine Vale has been recording conversations for 2 years, her own insurance policy against Rourke, in the event the arrangement turned against her. The recording she made of the planning session for tonight," she looked at Rourke, "was delivered to my phone 6 hours ago by a woman who decided that her arrangement with you had exceeded its useful life." Rourke went very still. "Celine sent it to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "People make survival calculations," Seraphine said. "You taught her that." The recording existed. It was real. Celine Vale, having watched the affidavit get filed and the summit get organized, and Rourke's confidence in the outcome remain absolute in ways that didn't account for how wrong things were going, had made the specific decision that a woman with Seraphine's resources and Seraphine's track record was a more durable long-term bet than a man whose plan was visibly unraveling. The recording contained, among other things, a detailed discussion of the mercenary placement in the opera house, the override code procurement through a bribed member of Seraphine's security team, a name she had already passed to the relevant people, and Rourke's explicit instructions about what to do with Seraphine once she had been subdued and the families had been shown that their network's architect was vulnerable. It also contained the name of the third family representative who had been turned, not Caruso, not Marco, but someone sitting in one of the 13 chairs right now. She watched Rourke understand how much was in the recording. She watched his face do the thing that faces do when a person comprehends that the position they believed they held no longer exists. "Take his people out," she said to the room's collective security. Gently. "They're not the problem." The room moved. Rourke's 9 men were escorted to the service exit, weapons collected, handled with the rough professional efficiency of people who had done this before. Rourke himself stood where he was, and nobody touched him yet, because Seraphine hadn't said to. "There's one more name on that recording," she said to the ring of family heads. Her voice was steady now. Steadier than before. The adrenaline metabolizing into the particular cold clarity she had learned to use as fuel. "One of you in this room has been working with Rourke, not Caruso. Caruso is not here tonight because I made sure he wasn't invited. But someone sitting in this ring received payment from Rourke's structure in exchange for intelligence about the cooperation framework." She looked around the ring, not slowly, not dramatically, just directly, one face at a time. "That person knows who they are. And in approximately 4 minutes, everyone in this room will also know, because the recording is going to play." The room went very quiet. In the quiet, Roman Vescari stood up from the Vescari seat. She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in 8 years of marriage, and could not entirely name, and he said, with a directness she recognized as what he looked like when he had nothing left to perform, "Tell me what you need me to do." She held his gaze for a moment that contained more than the moment could hold. Then she said, "Stand next to me while it plays." He crossed the ring and stood beside her. The recording began. The recording lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Nobody spoke while it played. Nobody moved in any meaningful way. Small adjustments, weight shifting, one of the Brannigan seconds pressing 2 fingers to his mouth and holding them there like he was keeping something in. But the ring held. The room held. 13 principals and their seconds and Roman Vescari standing beside Seraphine in the center, all of them listening to Cassian Rourke's voice come out of her phone speaker with the flat, clinical quality of a man discussing logistics. The name on the recording came at the 7-minute mark. It was the Costello representative, not the Don himself. The Don was in his 80s and hadn't traveled in 2 years, but his nephew, a man named Patrick Costello, who had been handling the Boston family's external affairs for the last 4 years, and who had, according to the recording, been receiving structured payments from Rourke's second-layer financial operation for 14 months in exchange for intelligence about the cooperation framework's pressure points. Patrick Costello sat in the Boston chair and listened to his own name come out of the speaker and did not run, did not stand, did not reach for anything. He sat very still with his hands on his knees and his face doing the complicated work of a man who has known this moment was theoretically possible and has been refusing to fully imagine it until now, when it is no longer theoretical. When the recording ended, the room stayed quiet for 3 full seconds. Then the Brannigan representative, a hard-faced man from Pittsburgh named Declan, who had been in this world since his early 20s and who expressed most things through the quality of his silence rather than through speech, stood up, walked across the ring to the Boston chair, and stood in front of Patrick Costello with his hands at his sides. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. Patrick Costello looked up at him. Something moved across his face. Not quite shame, not quite defiance. The specific expression of a man caught between 2 versions of himself and unable to commit to either. "My uncle doesn't know," Patrick said. His voice was steady, which took a kind of nerve that Seraphine reluctantly noted. "I want that on record. The Don had no involvement." The Dawn will hear from us directly, Seraphine said. Patrick nodded. He put his hands on his knees and pushed himself to standing, which was the gesture of a man who has decided that how he stands up matters, even when everything else has gone wrong. He looked once around the ring, not appealing to anyone, just looking, as if fixing the room in memory, and then he walked toward the service exit without being told to. 2 of the Brannigan seconds followed him out. The room exhaled. Rourke was still standing at the edge of the ring. He had listened to the recording with the expression of a man listening to a verdict he expected but hoped wouldn't be delivered so precisely. His composure was intact in a technical sense. His face was controlled, his posture was correct, but something had gone out of it. The quality of a man who believes the room is still his to manage had been replaced by something more honest and considerably less comfortable. Seraphine turned to face him. "Here's what happens now," she said. "You're going to sit down with every family representative in this room over the next 72 hours and account for every action taken against any cooperative agreement in the last 14 months. Not as a negotiation, as a full account. The families will determine independently what remediation they require. You will not leave the city until that process is complete." Rourke looked at her, then at the ring, then back at her. "And if I decline?" "Then you walk out of this building and into a situation where 13 organizations, all of whom now know exactly what you've been doing, are no longer constrained by the cooperative framework that kept their conflict management orderly." She kept her voice completely neutral. "I've spent 6 years helping these families not go to war with each other. I have no mechanism for extending that service to you." He understood what she was saying. She could see it in the stillness that moved through him. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of the specific shape of an outcome he had not planned for. He had built his model on the assumption that the old families were inefficient and fragmented. He had not built it to account for what 13 of them looked like when they were unified and had a specific target. "You're not going to hand me to anyone," he said. "No. That would create complications I don't need. You're going to hand yourself to a process." She paused. "The difference between you and the families in this room, Mr. Rourke, is not that you're more efficient. It's that you have no framework for accountability, no structure that exists outside of your own judgment. That works well when your judgment is correct. It's catastrophic when it isn't." She let that sit. "Your judgment tonight was not correct." Another silence. In it, Rourke did something she had not predicted. He laughed, short, dry, not quite bitter. The laugh of a man who has genuinely been surprised and is acknowledging it with the only gesture that doesn't cost him more than he has left. "You're extraordinary," he said. "I meant it when I said it on the phone." "I know," she said. "Sit down, Mr. Rourke." He sat. Celine Vale walked through the front entrance of the Opera House at 10:47, 40 minutes after the recording had finished playing, as if she had timed her arrival to come after the main event and before the cleanup. She had, in fact, timed it precisely for that reason. She looked different from the woman at the Carteret Gala. Less architecture in her presentation, the precise construction of the red dress and the careful performance of that evening had been replaced with something more functional. Dark clothes. Hair pulled back. The look of a woman who has decided that the persona is no longer useful and has set it down. She stopped at the entrance to the main room and looked at the ring of chairs, at the family representatives, at Rourke, sitting in a chair at the edge of the ring with the posture of a man who has given up a considerable amount in the last hour, and finally at Seraphine. "He didn't tell you I was coming," Celine said. "Not to anyone specifically, to the room." "He didn't know," Seraphine said. "That was the point." Celine looked at her for a moment. Her face had something in it that was harder to read than the persona had been, more actual, less constructed. "I want something in exchange for the recording," she said. "I've always wanted something. I'm not pretending otherwise." "I know." Exit, clean, no families, no exposure. Whatever arrangements he built in my name, she looked at Rourke. "I want those dissolved." "That depends on what the families determine is owed for the damage done," Seraphine said. "I can speak to your cooperation. I can't guarantee outcomes I don't control." Celine considered that. "Fair," she said, with the tone of a woman who did not say that word lightly and was saying it now because she meant it. She looked around the room once more. At the family heads, at the ring of power she had spent 2 years trying to insert herself into, At Roman Vescari, sitting in the Vescari seat with his face doing the work of a man who is processing more than one reckoning simultaneously. Then she looked at Seraphine's right hand, the bare one. "He was going to put it on me permanently," she said, quietly. The information offered without framing, without apology. That was the plan. Once you were removed, once the cooperation framework collapsed, the ring would make me the face of whatever centralized structure Rourke built. The families would have no framework left to refuse it. "I know," Seraphine said. "He thought the ring was the thing." She looked at it. He didn't understand that the ring was just jewelry. "No," Seraphine said. "He didn't." Celine nodded once. She found a chair at the edge of the room, not in the ring, and sat down, and that was that. The accounting with Rourke lasted 3 days. Seraphine was present for all of it. She ran the sessions with the precision she brought to everything operational, structured, documented, each family's representative given specific time and specific focus, the entire process recorded with the explicit consent of everyone present. She did not perform neutrality. She was genuinely interested in the outcomes reaching a point where the cooperative framework could absorb the damage and continue, which required that the damage be fully understood before anyone decided what to do about it. What emerged across 3 days was more complicated than a villain's plan. It was a picture of a financial architecture that had been patient and methodical, and that had genuinely identified real structural vulnerabilities in the federated model, places where the old family's resistance to centralization created blind spots that someone sufficiently positioned and sufficiently willing to wait could have exploited with or without Rourke specifically. She filed that information away. She would need it. Rourke sat across the table from various family representatives and answered questions with the slightly dazed quality of a man who has been enormously capable for a long time and is in the novel position of being asked to account for that capability to people he had spent years treating as institutional obstacles rather than human counterparties. He was not broken by it, but he was changed by it. She could see the change accreting across the 3 days. Small adjustments in how he held himself, in the length of his pauses before answering, in the way he began by the 3rd day to ask questions of the family representatives rather than only responding to theirs. She did not know what to make of that yet. She noted it. On the evening of the 3rd day, after the last session had ended, and the opera house had emptied of everyone except Seraphine and Ruth, and 2 of Seraphine's security people, Rourke put on his coat in the entrance hallway and said without turning around, "The vulnerabilities I found are real. They don't go away because I'm out of the picture." "I know," she said. "Someone else will find them." "I know that too." He turned around. "And?" "And that's my problem, not yours." She looked at him evenly. "Go build something that doesn't require destroying what other people built. You're clearly capable of it." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the specific nod of a man acknowledging something he doesn't fully understand yet but has decided to take seriously, and walked out. She stood in the entrance for a moment after the door closed. The quiet of the empty building settled around her. Old buildings had a particular quality of silence, heavier than new construction, weighted with the acoustic memory of everything they'd held. She was tired in a way that sleep hadn't fully addressed in 2 weeks. The kind of tired that wasn't rest deficit, but rather the depletion that came from running at a level of intensity that the body wasn't designed to sustain indefinitely. She let herself feel it for 60 seconds. Then she put on her coat and went home. Victor Caruso was arrested 4 days later on charges that had nothing to do with the affidavit. The affidavit itself was withdrawn, a procedural matter, a question about the validity of supporting documentation handled through channels that Seraphine had no visible connection to. The charges Caruso faced were older, the kind that federal investigators develop slowly and deploy when other leverage becomes available, and they were solid enough that no amount of repositioning would help him. She heard about his arrest through Elena, who called her the morning it happened. "How long did you have the federal material on Caruso?" Elena asked. 2 years, Seraphine said. A silence. "You held it for 2 years. I didn't need it for 2 years. I needed it now." Another silence, longer, the quality of a woman recalibrating something. "You're frightening," Elena said, without it being an insult. "I'm thorough," Seraphine said. "There's a difference." Elena laughed. Not warmly exactly, but genuinely. The laugh of a woman who has spent decades in difficult rooms and can still recognize something that earns it. The council proposal, she said, shifting. I've been thinking about it. And? It's the right structure. No single dawn with unilateral authority, rotating chair, documented dispute resolution. It's what we should have built 10 years ago. A pause. You'll chair it. No, Seraphine said. I'll architect it. I'll make sure it functions. But I won't chair it. A council with a permanent chair isn't a council. It's a different hierarchy with a different name. Then who? Rotating, 6-month terms, starting with whoever the families elect at the first formal session. And if they elect you, then I serve 6 months and step back. Elena was quiet for a moment. Roman's role. This was the question she had been waiting for. That's not my decision, she said. The council will determine whether the Vescari seat continues in his name or passes. And your recommendation? She thought about the man who had stood beside her in the opera house when the recording played, who had crossed the ring without being asked, who had asked what she needed and then done it, without condition, without negotiating the terms first, who had driven himself to a meeting with 2 unfamiliar men because she'd asked him not to bring Caruso and he had heard what that meant. She thought about 8 years, about what was real in them and what wasn't, and about the difficulty of holding both assessments simultaneously without letting either one cancel the other. My recommendation, she said, is that the council make its own determination based on demonstrated conduct going forward. Past decisions are evidence, not verdict. That's generous, Elena said. It's accurate, she said. They're not the same thing. Roman came to the opera house on the 5th day after the accounting ended, when the building was empty, and the chairs had been cleared and the room was just a room again. High ceilings, amber light, the smell of old wood, and the particular atmosphere of spaces that have held significant things. He didn't call ahead. She was there reviewing the documentation structure for the council framework when she heard the front entrance open, and she knew from the sound of the footsteps, the specific weight distribution, the pace, who it was before she saw him. He stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at the space for a moment before looking at her. She had noticed he did that more now. Looked at spaces before people, as if he was learning to read rooms instead of just projecting authority into them. It was small and it was new, and she noted it the way she noted everything, without assigning it more weight than it had earned yet. Victor's been charged, he said. I know. 30 years. He walked into the room slowly, not toward her specifically, more around the perimeter, like a man who needs to be in motion to think. 30 years and I didn't know. You weren't supposed to know. He was specifically positioned to be someone you didn't question. That's not... He stopped. His jaw moved. That's not a defense. I know that. She said nothing. He made a circuit of the empty room and ended up approximately 10 feet from where she was standing, which felt like a deliberate distance, close enough to have a conversation, far enough to not be presuming anything. I've been thinking, he said, about what you said, about loyalty being rebuilt through consequences rather than apologies. She waited. I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that I'm not asking it because I expect a particular answer. I'm asking it because I need to know what's true. He looked at her directly. Is there a version of this where I'm still your husband? Not as an operational arrangement, as something real. She held his gaze. The question was the right question, asked in the right way, without performance or self-justification, which she registered as the most honest thing he had said to her in longer than she could immediately calculate. I don't know, she said. That's true, Roman. I'm not saying it to punish you. I genuinely don't know. Okay. He said it without flinching, which she had not been certain he was capable of. That's okay. What I know, she said, is that the version of our marriage where I managed things you weren't supposed to see and you accepted a stability you didn't understand, that version is finished. What might exist after it would need to be something else entirely. Something neither of us has done before. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I, she said. That's actually the most honest thing we've said to each other in about 4 years. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not quite grief. The expression that lives between them when something is both painful and, under the pain, slightly releasing. He ran one hand through his hair, which was a gesture she associated with him in private rather than in performance, and looked at the ceiling for a moment and said, I handed the ring to the wrong person. Yes. In front of everyone. Yes. I'm going to carry that for a long time. I know, she said. So will I. For different reasons. He looked at her. She looked back. The room was very quiet around them. The specific quiet of a space that has heard enough shouting and recorded voices and the creak of chairs under significant weight, and is resting now in something simpler. The council, he said. Yes. You're building something that distributes what I had. I'm building something that doesn't collapse when one person makes a catastrophic mistake, or when one person leaves. She paused. Or when one person was never really what everyone thought they were. He absorbed that. The Vescari seat will be determined by the council, and you won't advocate for me. I won't advocate against you either. Your record will speak. That's fair, he said, and she could hear that he meant it. Not the practiced fairness of a man performing graciousness, but the raw kind that comes from a person who has recently and painfully understood the difference between what is owed to him and what he has earned. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. She watched his hand and didn't move. He brought out the queen's ring. She looked at it. He held it in the flat of his palm, not offering it, just showing it. It was small under the amber light of the opera house, smaller than it ever looked in her memory, which was how significant objects tended to look when you finally stripped the ceremony from around them. Celine gave it to me, he said. When she sent you the recording, she included it with a note. He paused. The note said, "Give this to the person who earned it. You know who that is." She looked at the ring for a long moment. She thought about her father in the diner parking lot on a Tuesday morning, about 19-year-old Seraphine counting from the side of the road with dry eyes because the counting was what she had. About a 23-year-old woman sitting across from a handsome man who laughed at her and deciding not to find it charming. About 14 months of individual meetings in rooms no one knew about Marco Fenn's kitchen and the particular tired look of a man who made a wrong choice and spent 14 months carrying it. About Cassian Rourke's thumb moving against his index finger in the moment he understood the architecture had rooms he'd never found. About 8 years. About what was real in them. She reached out and took the ring from his palm. She held it for a moment, felt the weight of it, literal weight, the metal and stone, less than she always expected, always less. And then she put it on her right hand, not because he had given it back, because it was hers, because it had always been hers in the sense that mattered, and the month it had spent elsewhere hadn't changed that, and she was done managing other people's understanding of what she carried. Roman watched her put it on. He didn't reach for her, he didn't say anything, and she was grateful for both. "The council's first session is in 3 weeks, she said. I'll be there. Bring documentation of your last 6 months of operational decisions. The council will want to review." "I know." She gathered her papers from the table and put them in her bag with the methodical attention she gave to all practical things. Roman watched her and stayed where he was, which was correct. She walked toward the exit. At the doorway she stopped, not because she had anything more to say, but because the room deserved a moment. This room that had held the weight of 3 days and an accounting and a recording and the specific sound of 13 people listening to the truth about what had been built around them. She turned around once. Roman was still standing in the center of the room, hands at his sides, looking at her with the expression of a man who has lost something he didn't know how to value until he watched it nearly disappear, and who has just enough self-awareness to understand that this is his to carry without making it her problem. She looked at him for a moment. She nodded once. Then she walked out of the opera house into the early morning, and the door closed behind her, and the city was already in full movement. Traffic and voices, and the ordinary complicated noise of a place that doesn't pause for anyone's reckoning. And she walked through it with her right hand at her side and the ring on her finger and the council framework in her bag, and the full accounting of everything that had happened held somewhere in her chest, where she would need to sit with it for a long time before she understood all of what it meant. The council met 3 weeks later, as she had said. The 13 families elected a rotating chair. The first term was 6 months. The dispute resolution protocols she had built were embedded in the governing documents with redundancies she had tested against every vulnerability Rourke had identified, because he had been right that the vulnerabilities were real, and she was not in the business of ignoring useful information regardless of its source. The Vescari seat passed to Roman on a provisional basis. 11 votes in favor, 1 abstention, 1 against, with a performance review at the first session's end. She voted with the majority. She did not explain her reasoning to anyone, which was her right. Marco Fenn appeared before the council in month 2 and gave a full accounting. The families determined his remediation. She was present but did not speak during his testimony, and when it was over she did not seek him out, and he did not seek her out, and that was its own kind of resolution. Not forgiveness, not its absence, but the specific acknowledgement that some things can be processed and filed without being either forgiven or perpetuated. Celine Vale disappeared from the criminal world cleanly, which was what she had asked for. Seraphine did not track where she went. It wasn't her concern, and she had learned over the years the specific discipline of releasing information that had served its purpose rather than hoarding it simply because she had built the habit of holding things. The ring stayed on her right hand, not because she needed anyone to see it, not because it signaled anything to the room, though it did. It signaled the same thing it had always signaled, and that signal was now both older and cleaner than it had been before the night at the Carteret. She wore it because it was hers, because her name was on the history of the thing, whether anyone knew it or not, because Gino Vescari had pressed it into her palm on his deathbed and said, "Don't waste it on ceremony," and she had, until now, been very careful not to. Now she wore it the way you wear something when you're done explaining it. On the morning of the council's third session, she arrived early. The building, a different space, purpose-built for the new structure, no borrowed drama of borrowed rooms, was not yet full. She stood at the window in the council chamber with coffee going cold in her hand and watched the city come into the early light. She was 41 years old. She had built a cooperation framework that had held 5 families in functional peace for 6 years, survived a coordinated attack from both inside and outside, and emerged with a structure that was more resilient than what it replaced. She had been publicly humiliated, privately betrayed, stripped of documentation, and handed a fabricated case against her own life. She was still here. That was not a small thing. She knew it wasn't a small thing, even if the knowing of it was quiet, even if it lived in her body rather than in any expression she would give it. She had earned the right to the quiet. She had earned the right to stand at a window with cold coffee and watch the light come up without explaining herself to anyone. The door opened behind her, footsteps she recognized. "You're early," Elena Morante said. "I'm always early." "I know." Elena came to stand beside her at the window. She was 67 years old and moved like someone who had long since made peace with the weight she carried, which was its own kind of strength. She looked out the window beside Seraphine for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "He's going to be all right, you know." Seraphine didn't ask who she meant. "I know." "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking whether you are." She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was her habit with all questions, regardless of who asked them. She thought about the last month and the last 8 years, and the 19-year-old counting from the side of a road, and the woman standing at this window with a ring on her right hand and a council chamber filling up behind her. Yes, she said. She meant it. That was enough. Ket the tron van ko trien trung num two. The council session lasted 4 hours. She ran it the way she ran everything, without excess, without theater, with the specific attention to process that made the difference between a meeting that produced decisions and a meeting that produced the appearance of decisions. 13 families, 13 sets of interests. One table, round because she had insisted on round because the shape of the table was not a small thing when the people sitting at it had spent decades measuring their position in rooms. Roman spoke twice, both times clearly, both times without performing authority he hadn't re-earned yet. The second time, the Brannigan representative asked him a direct question about the Eastern logistics restructuring, and Roman answered it with numbers he had clearly prepared, which meant he had prepared for the session rather than assumed his way through it. She noticed. She said nothing. When the session ended and the room emptied, she stayed behind to collect her papers. It was a habit. She was always the last one out of a working room, because the last 5 minutes of a room told you things the session itself didn't. Ruth came in to reset the chairs. Good session, Ruth said. Functional, Seraphine said. That's enough. She walked out into the hallway, down the stairs, through the lobby, and out the front door into the afternoon. The city received her the way cities receive everyone, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, with the absolute democracy of noise and movement and indifferent forward motion. She walked 2 blocks before she stopped. Not because anything was wrong, because she wanted to stop, because she could. She stood on the sidewalk with her bag over one shoulder and the ring on her right hand and the afternoon light coming down at the angle it comes in the fall, low and sideways and honest, the kind of light that doesn't soften anything. She thought about her father, not the parking lot, not the counting. Earlier, the man at the breakfast table on ordinary mornings, the way he held his coffee cup with both hands even when it was too hot, the way he looked at her sometimes with an expression she had spent 20 years trying to name and had finally decided was simply, I see you. She had built everything she built because she had been seen once by someone who mattered, and then that person was gone, and she had spent the rest of her life making sure the things she built could not be taken the same way. She had been right to build them. She had been right about almost everything. That was its own weight, not a bad weight, but real. She put her hand in her coat pocket and felt the cold fabric and the warmth her own body had already put into it, and she stood there for another moment in the ordinary afternoon, a woman in a city, finished with one thing and not yet begun with the next. Then she started walking. The ring caught the light once as she moved, a small flash that nobody around her noticed or looked up for, and she didn't look down at it either. She already knew it was there.